Some people say economists always get good at arm exercise because they're always saying on the one hand and then on the other hand. And I think that certainly applies to thinking about the prospects for reform of this budget process. On the one hand, we see, as many have said, a very polarized Congress. We've seen difficulty of getting members even to talk to each other and to get to know each other. We've seen efforts in recent years to improve the process, or even to use the process, as several have said, have been pretty disappointing. And so, you know, it's easy to be gloomy about the prospects for reform. On the other hand, I think there are some favorable signs, some of which have been mentioned, that may suggest that there is a possibility at some point in the future, maybe not immediately, for the reform planets to align and for us to see some changes. Now, I've been often accused of being an optimist, and I will do that right now, because I think there are certainly 4 signs that might suggest the possibility, at least of sometime in the not-too-distant future, of some reform in these areas, and some have been mentioned. The first, as I think Phil Joyce particularly focused on, we have seen within the Congress, in the budget committees in both chambers, the leadership, in particular the majority, holding a series of hearings to look in some depth at a lot of reform ideas. And there's a menu of ideas have developed from that. Now, I think in an election year, it's hard to imagine those will move forward very much, or even perhaps in the next several months in the new administration and Congress. There has been talk of ramming through some reform ideas around a budget agreement, or even possibly a debt ceiling change, as has been done in the past, of course. But I think the most important feature of this is that we are seeing a process of laying out very developed ideas and proposals and pieces of legislation through these committees for public conversation, and by conversation by organizations such as ours. So I think one of the things we've seen in this, which is an important sign, is the beginning of a more public conversation around some of these ideas emanating from leaders in Congress. I think, secondly, I think there's some indication that some of the interest groups and stakeholders who are directly affected by the budget process or the lack of an effective budget process are beginning to engage or be open to a conversation about how to craft a more effective budget process. There's a kind of prisoner's dilemma aspect to this, I think, where lots of organizations feel that by pursuing their own objectives rigidly and uniquely, that they're actually going to do less well than having a more constructive conversation down the road. And one organization represented here in the audience, which I'm also involved in, an organization called Convergence, the Convergence Center for Policy Resolution, is actually bringing together a range of stakeholders directly affected by the budget and the budget process to say, is there a way we can think about a mutually beneficial changes in the budget process that would advance all our objectives? I think a third indication, again, which has been mentioned, is that if you like, the usual suspects in the research community have increased their activities and developed a number of major proposals. Bipartisan Policy Center, Brookings, of course, NAPA and others have been doing this with much more enthusiasm, I think, in recent months. And I would say, finally, perhaps, after this election, maybe the leaders of both parties and parts of the government might come to the conclusion that it is in their mutual interest to begin to indicate to the American people that the government can, in some ways, actually function as a way of beginning to kind of build confidence in a system, in our democracy, that will allow the variety of ideas of what should be done in the country to be debated and for budgets to be put together that reflect those. So perhaps there's reason for some optimism. Well, let's see if the panel agrees with me on that. I suspect some might not, on the possibilities. And to think about how would we set up conditions, a political environment that might make it more conducive to changes in the process in the future. And we have four political scientists and veterans of the budget process and the budget. They're all members of our budgeting roundtable. And let me introduce them very briefly and let them share their views. First, Roy Myers, at the, I would say the far right, which may not be ideal for him, but at the far right, who is professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And Roy has written extensively, including with a paper outside, on how lawmakers make decisions and how one might be able to craft different language and a different framework to get more effective conversations taking place. Secondly, my colleague Molly Reynolds, who's a fellow in governance studies here at Brookings, who's written extensively on the Senate, on the budget resolution, and other aspects of the political process. Third, Bill Hoagland, who is Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center and is a 33-year veteran of federal government service, including many years on the staff of the Senate Budget Committee. And last but by no means least, my colleague Alice Rivlin, who's pretty much had every budget job it's possible to have in Washington, as far as I can see. She's been director of the Office of Management and Budget, vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board, and the founding director of the Congressional Budget Office. So let's begin with Roy. Over to you.
So thanks, Stuart. Good morning, everyone. I guess I prefer the audience's perspective. Maybe I'm on the center left. So I want to make 2 points this morning. First, that reforming the budget process will be very difficult, but it won't be impossible. And despite the current political situation, the next few years may actually see a greater chance of meaningful change than has been the case in recent years. And second, that a plausible strategy for reforming the budget process is emerging. This strategy emphasizes what Steve proposed, portfolio budgeting, which could satisfy the interests of both parties to participate in a fair fight over how the budget allocates funds. So to start with the first topic, last year I wrote a paper for the National Budgeting Roundtable that's online, and a brief version of that paper was published this spring by Brookings, is available today. And the title of that longer paper is The Political Feasibility of Doing What is Almost Impossible. So I want to start with emphasizing what makes this situation almost impossible, which in effect means that only minor reforms to the process can be adopted by the majority party through rules. Rather, rules forced through at the beginning of a Congress without the assent of the minority. Most significant reforms will have to be bipartisan. But of course, we've just talked about how this process in American politics has become the opposite of bipartisan. We're very polarized, and there are vast differences between the two parties on most major policy questions. And that's a problem because budgeting is a process in which traditionally the parties have resolved their differences, at least partially, by making temporary compromises. And in addition, we have had traditionally a norm that annual budgets and appropriations bills have to be completed. That norm is dead. It's absolutely dead. And when Rick said he needed to educate the members, that's a good illustration of that. Frankly, from the perspective of budgeting people, it's inexcusable that bills aren't passed. And the same thing with budget resolution. And we need to come back to improving that. Yeah, I know, it's the feedback. Is that better? We need to get back to a situation where the norms of budgeting are really paid more attention to. In addition, we have this election year, which is completely atypical. The typical election year highlights major differences between the parties. Okay, back here. Okay. This election season has, in effect, neglected most major policy issues. And I'm going to step on a limb and say there's a likely winner, which is Secretary Clinton. And I don't think she's going to have much of a mandate from this. The only good thing I see from this election regarding issues regarding the budget process is that the prospective Vice President, Senator Kaine, has been an active supporter of better budgeting while governor of Virginia and as a member of the Senate Budget Committee. He actually participated in the hearings that Senator Enzi chaired. In the House, the GOP has published not only the publications that Rick mentioned, but from the Speaker's office, 6 Better Way publications, which appear to me to be preparation for a substantial policy and process move next year, that with what are mostly familiar party positions in great contrast to what Mr. Trump has proposed. And the Better Way publication on the Constitution promises, and I underline promises, to pass appropriations and regularly scheduled reauthorizations on time. Speaker Ryan also said yesterday, or maybe it was Sunday, that he would like to start with tax reform. And frankly, I think there is some potential for tax reform, but I'll be interested to see the negotiations about how like-kind exchanges of depreciated real estate property will be treated in the tax code. So my guess is that the fallout in the GOP from this presidential election will take a fair amount of time to settle. And I'll leave it to Molly to discuss how the margins of party control on each side of the Capitol Hill will affect prospects for budget reform. However, I do want to agree with Steve and Phil and Stuart in their observation that the House and Senate Budget Committee hearings are a somewhat encouraging sign, although I'll say only somewhat. First, as Stan and others have said, some think that the process hearings were a cover for the unwillingness to make timely budget decisions. And second, the hearings revealed very substantial differences between the parties in how the process might be improved, particularly in the House. I think as we well know, the polarization in the House is somewhat larger than it is in the Senate on budget processes, on many other issues. But on the good side, I think these hearings also showed that many legislators are frustrated and embarrassed by the congressional budget dysfunction, and that's a necessary step for reform. Shortly after the Congressional Budget Act was passed, Thomas Dodd, a political scientist, wrote a number of very good articles about how Congress reforms itself. And he argued that in the case of the Congressional Budget Act, one reason why it's passed is that members decided that their own electoral prospects were harmed by serving in a dysfunctional body. Now, they can get away with that for a while by running against their colleagues and running against the institution. Dick Fenno wrote a famous article for Time magazine saying, basically asking if Congress is the broken branch of government, why do we love our members of Congress so much? And the answer was that they were all running against Congress. But eventually you can't get away with that, and I think we've reached that point. Another positive result from the Senate hearings is that I think there was some bipartisan recognition of the desirability of making at least some minor changes, such as limiting the vote-a-rama charade that Phil mentioned. So to get to the second point, what is the plausible strategy for reform? I think the Budget Control Act of 2011 was a massive mistake in trying to create a grand bargain for debt reduction. I don't think that it was possible to force one through so-called action-forcing mechanisms. And actually, to bolster Phil's point, I wrote an article called The Implosion of the Federal Budget Process that was published in Public Budgeting and Finance about that very issue. There really wasn't enough trust between the parties to enable compromises over the big differences that they have, including the tax pledge and Social Security expansion. So instead, we focus on the backup provisions of that act for discretionary spending, which create stupid policies, and it had to be revised in 2013 and 2015. It'll have to be revised again next year. So I think the better alternative is to drop the obsession with a grand bargain and instead try and figure out how we can improve how the budget process allows government officials to allocate the government's limited funds. And I think the portfolio approach is the right first step on this alternative path. After all, you only can get fiscal discipline for the whole of government if you have a reasonable way of allocating funds for each part of the budget. Senator Enzi has suggested that a subcommittee of the Budget Committee could be tasked with reviewing a sector of the budget, including spending through the tax code. That's a Republican saying, looking at spending through the tax code, which would allow, quote, reducing wasteful spending and focusing attention on measurable results. And by the way, no legislation is needed for this. The Budget Committee could appoint subcommittees and could use reconciliation, and that could be tied to the Government Performance Results Act, Modernization Act, that Steve mentioned, given the strategic plans that are supposed to be coming out of the agencies over the next couple of years. In some contrast, the staff paper from the House Budget Committee majority warned against this approach as potentially promoting a, quote, tax and spend, end quote, result. And I think that's an unfortunate conclusion, although I understand that it's responsive to the House Freedom Caucus's opinions. So I think the real challenge that we face is how to convince each side that they'll get enough out of the portfolio approach to make its risks worthwhile. In the Brookings brief that was handed out here, I mentioned two framing approaches for trying to make that argument. First is, I think far too often we talk about budget process reforms as the equivalent of terribly tasting medicine that must be swallowed in hopes of avoiding certain and immediate death or imminent death. And that negativity is really not credible. Instead, I think we need to be much more positive, to switch from the medicinal metaphor to replace the sticks of budget process reform discipline with the carrots of how can we make the United States a better place by devising a way to allocate funds that will make programs more effective. Second, the portfolio approach will enable each side to have a say in a fair fight over how spending and tax policies in each sector of the budget should be improved. To quote two sentences from my brief, deficit hawks should especially value this level playing field effect because it would encourage more competition between claimants for funds. Competition's a good thing, most Americans believe in that. And those who want to expand spending on specific programs could claim that reallocating funds from ineffective and low-priority programs would produce opportunity benefits. Again, switching from the opportunity cost negative idea to the opportunity benefits of making America, well, better again. To be clear, and I suppose controversial to some extent, I view this approach as the minimal needed reform. I agree with Phil's suggestion that over the long run, Congress needs to make larger reforms to its duplicative and inefficient committee structure and legislative procedures. Alice said that many years ago, and she was right then. Congressman Lipinski and LaHood have sponsored a bill that would create a new committee on the organization of Congress, which I hope will be considered seriously next year. For now, no, I think we should try the baby step of portfolio budgeting. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Thank you all for coming. What I'd like to do today is two things, and the first is to ask if advocates of budget process reform in Congress have any hope of building momentum for any sort of process changes, what questions do we need to answer? And here I'd like to begin by reminding us that fundamentally legislative processes and procedures, whether they're in the budget process or anywhere else, are about allocating power within the chamber, and changing them changes who has the power. So first question is, can you convince individual members that it's in their political interests to support process reforms? And Roy touched on this a little bit. But specifically, would budget process changes reallocate power in a way that makes it easier for individual members to achieve their individual goals, especially re-election? So let's think, for example, about biennial budgeting, which was mentioned briefly on the first panel. So is there something about setting budget aggregates every 2 years that would make individual members of Congress better off? Maybe, if it means that appropriations bills were actually more likely to be considered. I think individual members would consider that a worthy goal. Individual appropriations bills give members a chance to offer amendments, take positions on particular issues. That to some degree assumes that the obstacle to finishing the appropriations process is not enough time. So you can take that or leave that. On the same logic, take changing consideration of the budget resolution, which, as Stuart mentioned, is something that I've done some work on. So members claim to hate, especially in the Senate, the current consideration of the budget resolution, the vote-a-rama. But there's a solid argument to be made that the vote-a-rama represents one of the few chances that members have in the Senate now to actually offer amendments in a way that's unstructured by the party leadership. And so would you actually be able to convince members to give up their chance to offer amendments? So second question, what are the consequences for budget process reform for existing power bases in Congress? And so I think one of the biggest lessons that we should take away from the passage of the Congressional Budget Act in 1974 was that that act did little to threaten existing power bases in Congress and simply imposed a new structure on top of the existing set of appropriations, authorizing, and revenue committees. So where are the power bases today? There's some sense that the power of authorizing committees has declined in Congress. Is there a way to convince members, particularly authorizers, that moving to some different parts of the budget process would reinvigorate the role of committees more broadly? I could imagine portfolio budgeting, if cast to reinvigorate some power for authorizers, would get some traction here. To think about one of the things Phil mentioned earlier, if we were to try and strengthen the budget committee, where would that power come at the expense of? Would it come at the expense of someone else? And then the third question is, what's the relationship between process and outcomes? Just like we can't isolate the process from the politics, we can't isolate the process from the outcomes that the process produces. So any ability to build momentum for process changes must account for the fact that members, especially rank and file members, without expertise in how the process works, are likely concerned that a coalition that is pushing a set of changes to the process would be doing so because they want to produce a set of policies that a new process would be easier to achieve. And members aren't wrong to be worried about this. There are other changes to congressional rules and procedure that have been motivated by similar political concerns rather than by principled motivations about how to make the institution work better. And this is a particular challenge if a set of process changes in the budget process or otherwise are being largely advocated by members of one party. So the second thing I want to do is, shockingly to no one, we're about to have an election. And what could this mean for the prospects of building a budget reform coalition? So in the House, again, shocking to no one, we're in the midst of a period of pretty significant intra-party conflict among elite Republicans, especially within the House Republican Party. There are reasons to think that the House Republican Conference may get smaller in the next Congress. There's a lot of hand-wringing right now in the political press about how many seats Democrats are likely to pick up in the House. I'm not going to forecast that here. If I could do that well, this would not be the job I should have. But what's important to note is that if Democrats do pick up seats, they're likely to be in swing districts. And as a result, they're likely to replace the kinds of members who have been, in the past several Congresses, more likely to go along with big, sweeping budget deals that are negotiated by Republican and Democratic leaders. The House Freedom Caucus and other allied members on the more conservative wing of the House Republican Party may increase in both size and influence in the next Congress. So there's some evidence that the Freedom Caucus has recruited candidates or been involved in helping to recruit candidates in some open Republican seats, recruit candidates who are more likely to be allied with them. We saw this happen in the seat that used to be John Boehner's in Ohio. And then in influence, so if the Republican conference overall is smaller and the Freedom Caucus and its allies make up a larger share of that conference, and we may see them be more influential. So in the Senate, whichever party wins the Senate, and that's still quite unclear, is likely to have a small majority. So we're going to be dealing with a small either Republican or a Democratic majority in the Senate. And so what this means is that if we do have a stronger sort of conservative wing of the House Republican Conference, that means a more influential group in the conference who may see budget process reform as being more closely associated with a particular set of policy outcomes. And that opens up sort of two possibilities as I see it. One is that a conservative wing of the House Republican Party pushes for a set of budget process reforms that reflect a set of their policy priorities, which would be extremely difficult to move in the Senate, even if Republicans controlled the Senate, unless you go the reconciliation route, which would have its own challenges, and just wouldn't make a lot of sense if we have a Democratic president who'd be likely to veto something. A more bipartisan approach that would basically write off or jettison some more conservative House votes in favor of Democratic votes would be, I think, a suboptimal place for the Speaker of the House to alienate the right end of his caucus. If we think there's some sort of maximum tolerance for taking votes in the House that some Republicans oppose, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to use one of those on budget process reform. So finally, what about this notion that's been, I think, mentioned in the press and that was mentioned on the first panel, that the place where we might see budget process reform in a new Congress is as a part of a broader budget agreement, especially something that's considered must pass, like a new 2-year budget agreement or a debt ceiling measure. So in principle, this makes some sense. To the extent that Congress has a negotiating strength anymore, it's the ability to log roll things together. In the current partisan environment, large omnibus measures with carefully constructed log rolls have been an important tool for leaders to get things accomplished without having to take repeated votes, which is especially hard in a polarized system where coalition building is a challenge. If we're talking about some of the smaller scale changes that we've discussed, there's some evidence from the political science literature that those kinds of measures are more likely to make it into big omnibus bills. Divided government, which we are increasingly likely to see in the new year, also increases the likelihood of omnibus legislating. The catch here is that you want something that's important enough to have supporters who are willing to fight for its inclusion in an omnibus, but not something that's so important to opponents that if it's in there, it would have the potential to derail a deal. And I'll stop there.
Good morning, everyone. Let me, before I begin, give a shout out to Dan Blair and the service that he's given to Napa. Maybe some of you might know that he is stepping down as the leader of that organization. I only know that because I was asked to serve on a search committee to replace him, and we're working on it. But let me begin with a simple fact that it's been already discussed briefly here, is when the governing process fails to function, or more importantly, when it's perceived by a majority of the electorate to have failed, I think reform is not only necessary but essential to maintain our democratic process. And I think the fact that the House and Senate have concluded their business for the last 18 years in a lame duck session following an election, and we're going to have a 19th year now, is clearly an indication that the process is not functioning correctly. And that's not to mention what has already been mentioned a few times here. Only once in the last 20 years have all appropriation bills been completed on time, and only once in the last 7 years have we had a conference agreement on a budget resolution. Further, I've always used as a mantra that governing is budgeting, and budgeting is governing. I now say if you cannot govern, you cannot budget. And as Stuart made an observation at the outset today, we know that from long-running surveys, research, that the public's confidence in Congress is at its lowest point ever since such research has been conducted. And now when confidence in the Congress is at these very historically low levels, it makes it even harder to advance positive reforms, since the level of cynicism and skepticism only feeds on itself, and the public's perception is that the reforms are not really reforms at all, but changes to benefit those, quote, who are in power. So it's a vicious circle. And I think it should be clear by now for everyone from the presidential campaign that there is a very large swath of the American public out there who believe that the process has failed them, and quite frankly, for many middle America, it has failed. So whether you support a Democrat or Republican candidates in a few weeks, I think the key to the purpose of this panel, overcoming political, the key is to be able to restore confidence in the government, and it's crucial if we're going to overcome those obstacles to reforming the federal budget. But and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But as it relates to the process itself, first, I think as Phil said it earlier, I think the basic structure of the '74 Congressional Budget Impoundment Control Act was sound. I argue that in many ways the act was not meant to necessarily force a particular policy outcome, but rather to put in place a very straightforward accounting system for the Congress so that the right hand knew what the left hand was doing. And it was a system that created a process to set broad parameters for spending and revenues at the beginning of the session, and so that once they had finished their session, they were not shocked by what the outcomes they had produced. In many ways, the process was agnostic from my perspective as to whether it would produce surpluses or deficits, but at least if they carried out the process, they would know they were producing surpluses or deficits ahead of time, and a fiscal blueprint would be set, something that did not exist before the '74 Act. That process changed, however, I would argue, in the early Reagan years with the use of the so-called reconciliation process more broadly, but most importantly, and with the reforms included later in the passage of the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act in 1985. And those reforms, many of which we are still living with in the aftermath today, set very fixed policy goals. At that particular time, a balanced budget at a fixed date. And I would argue that those changes fundamentally altered the process from basically being a policy-neutral process, an accounting tool, to one that attempted to force outcomes to a specific fiscal outcome. Now, I've been a participant in some of these reform proposals over the years. Some of you in the audience I know might also say that they were complete failures, and I was responsible for that. Fine. So any advice I give today probably should be looked at probably with some skepticism. But I have come to the conclusion that we can talk all we want about changing our maybe to a biennial budgeting or appropriation cycle, or recreating the Commission on Budget Concepts, both changes, by the way, which I support. We can talk about changing it from a concurrent resolution to a joint resolution, eliminating vote-a-rama. Quite just as a sidebar there, I've been through quite a few vote-a-ramas, and I've always concluded that at least it was a safety valve, and they were doing less damage with voting on amendments that didn't mean anything than on votes that really did. So let me come back to just from the scriptures. Physician, heal thyself. Congress, the governing body, needs to heal thyself before it's too late. And there is no shortage of ideas. We've already heard a lot of them, of how Congress might heal itself, from academia, from media, my organization, Bipartisan Policy Center, to NAPA, to Brookings, Congressional Institute. Clearly, we are not short of ideas, and ideas, many of them that have merit, I would agree. We cultivate ideas quite well. The problem is in growing them and harvesting them. And so I have come to the further conclusion that the time has arrived, as it did when we reached similar low points in the past, the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act, the 1946-70 Legislative Reorganization Act, and yes, the '74 Budget Act. It's come time to look at the entire legislative process, not just the budget process. And here there's some good news, and Roy's already mentioned a little bit of it. On September 28th, right before they went out and departed for the election, a bipartisan House concurrent resolution was introduced, sponsored by Republicans, the Republican Congressman Darren LaHood and Democratic Congressman Dan Lipinski, both of Illinois, to take this reform discussion to a new level. And the resolution, H-Con Res 169, would establish a bipartisan joint committee on the organization of Congress. It currently has 38 original co-sponsors on its introduction. That was as they were going out the door. So I would hope that when they come back after the election, that more will sign up on when in the post-election period. We have had 3 similar joint committees over the past 100 years, the last being created almost a quarter of a century ago. This particular joint committee would be comprised of 24 members, 12 each from the House and Senate, evenly divided between the parties. The resolution does not set a specific agenda. It would merely serve as the platform and the mechanism where all ideas, those discussed here, including those from in the public that could debate, and it would result in some final recommendations. Sadly, my old stomping ground, a companion resolution has not been introduced in the Senate, and of course, with only 12 scheduled legislative days when they return, the lame duck, no enactment of any of this is going to take place. But regardless of who controls the Senate or House in the 115th Congress, I would hope that the bipartisan nature of a resolution could be considered and adopted, that it would pave the, that if this was adopted, would pave the way for consensus on budget reform recommendations, and most importantly, begin this very arduous and slow task of trying to restore some of the public's confidence in their government. Reforms will not be enacted just by our good ideas here in think tanks or in academia or from advocacy work to promote these ideas. Congress has to do this themselves, and they have to show the public they can heal themselves to restore that lost trust.
I want to start by reassuring Stan Collender and anyone else that appearing on a budget process panel does not mean that I think that process is the problem or what we primarily need to fix. As many have said eloquently, we're witnessing a breakdown in our political process, in our governing process, which we have to heal if we're going to be a great nation. I don't think the problem is primarily in polarization of views, although that contributes. It is primarily in losing the idea, which is fundamental to our Constitution, that we need to have a process of compromise, that governing is compromise, and never is it more evident than in any budget making. Budget making is essentially compromising and allocating scarce resources among priorities in a compromise way. That said, we all agree that the budget process is broken. It hasn't been used, as Bill pointed out, or completed on time in a very long time. And even when it was working, it had major flaws. I think there are three. It's too complicated for most members to understand, too many layers that chew up too much time for Congress and the executive. That's not the fault of the 74 Act. It was already there, and the 74 Act was layered on top of an already complicated process. Second, it leaves out the most important parts of the budget. It left out entitlements and tax expenditures, which were already growing disproportionately in 1974 and have grown much more disproportionately since then, so that the focus, as everybody has said, is on a declining portion of the budget, and that doesn't make sense. And third, it never involved the president and the leadership of Congress in a clear way that allowed them to resolve their major differences and work together on the big decisions and then move things along. So while going back to regular order sounds nice, and it would certainly be better than doing nothing at all, regular order wasn't doing its job even when we were sort of following it. Now, it's tempting because we're scholars of the budget process in this situation to say, let's blow it all up and start over. Here's this neat plan of how things ought to be done, and we've heard a lot of good ideas today, and the people in this room could design a more elegant process that would have the right incentives for both speed and fiscal rectitude built in. I think such a process would be inclusive. It would include all spending, including tax expenditures and revenues. It would have a longer time horizon, and it would have the leadership heavily involved. And it's hard to do that without restructuring the committee structure first. And I was glad to hear Phil Joyce alluding to an idea that I first promulgated in before the '74 Act. Most of you weren't alive then, of restructuring the committee process. But as we all know, it isn't just the budget process that's broken. The whole decision process is broken, and especially if the Congress if we turn out to have the political situation, divided government, and the situation in the House and Senate that Molly describes, I would not advise anybody, either the new president or the new leadership of Congress, to start with trying to reform the budget process. They have to start with the minimum necessary things they can agree on to keep the government running, and then find ways to explore and act on the common ground that I believe they do have in the policy area that can allow them to show some things can function, and as Bill said, restore some confidence in government. So I would say maybe even start with an omnibus appropriation proposal for 2 years that would get the government funded, and you'd have to work out the compromise on how to do that, but just do it and get that out of the way. And then start working on some of the policy proposals on which I think they might find common ground. One of them would be a major infrastructure bill, and maybe some other investments in research, maybe early childhood. Another would be corporate tax reform. Another, believe it or not, I think would be Social Security reform. If you had done those major things in the first Congress, you would have done a lot. And then you could move on to some of the more controversial pieces, individual tax reform being one of them, and Medicare reform being another. I don't regard those as urgent or as feasible as the others, which is why I put them up front. But I think Bill is absolutely right. The task is for the two branches to work together as well as they can to restore confidence that our government is functioning, can do something, isn't totally broken, and I'd first get the appropriations out of the way for a couple of years and then say, what can we do together that will show that government functions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 30 minutes for question and conversation. But maybe I could just ask, initially, I heard when we heard the panelists, I think the argument, particularly by Roy and by Alice, that we should get away from the idea that we're going to get change in some big way as a result of dealing with a big crisis, the sort of the crisis view and instead sort of move much more towards an incremental approach. It's a little bit, I think, like the theories of dealing with achieving peace in the Middle East. Probably, rather than start with the future of Jerusalem, let's start with how we pick the garbage up in different parts of the areas. Is that a general consensus? I mean, Molly and Bill in particular, do you share that view?
I think that to the extent that there's any real possibility for getting anything done, yes. What's feasible is smaller rather than larger.
I concur that it's incremental changes are the way the process will be reformed. I guess maybe my hesitancy in answering this question is I look at that Joint Committee on the Reorganization of Congress as being something that's bigger than incremental, because you're talking about changing the structure of the Congress, you're changing the structure of the committees and their responsibilities. But at least that, to the extent you're setting the Reform Commission or the Joint Committee up, you're at least making an incremental step in that direction.
I would concur with that, but in part because I think getting people thinking about the structure of Congress is a really good thing, and it's going to take such a committee quite a long time before it brings anything to the floor. So I think this is not an incompatible notion.
All right, we have 2 microphones available for questions. Nobody provoked? Oh, yes, here we go. And please announce your name.
Romina Baccia with the Heritage Foundation. I wanted to talk about the point that Stuart just made in referring to the fact that the programs that are driving most of the increase in spending projected over the next 10, 20, 30 years also happen to be the most popular programs politically. Does that not mean then that in order to bring about any political motivation to do anything about those, you need a lot of political cover for those lawmakers who are going to tackle those programs, because any changes that you make, there will be losers. Now, there will be winners as well, because the status quo is not particularly suitable for many of the population's programs like Social Security and Medicaid are supposed to serve. But I do wonder if you need some sort of a crisis, and it could be combined with an economic crisis or fiscal crisis, to bring about the political cover where lawmakers can say, we need to make these changes. We knew all along these programs were unsustainable, but we had no political incentive to reform them. But now there's a natural limit, whether that be the deficit is out of control, borrowing costs spiral. We actually have to do something at this point. I just don't know that we're going to tackle these challenges with incremental changes, because there's no reason to.
Okay, I'll start. I think I'll put a specific policy in your category, which is health policy, and Alice and Bill know much more about this than I do. But it seems to me that the problem that we face, which is excessive cost and excessive cost growth, is also an opportunity, and that we need to think about how we structure the budget process to make it more likely we'll take advantage of the opportunities for incremental changes in the sector year after year after year to make the quality of health better and reduce the cost of both the private and public sector. Endless votes on repeal and replace is not the way to do it. Nor is the current structure that conducive to making the kind of intelligent changes in the health sector that we need. For example, we have a budget scorekeeping rule about so-called CHIMPs, changes in mandatory spending, which is an understandable way of trying to control gimmicks, but also prevents reasonable trade-offs between investments in the discretionary side of health spending, such as with HRSA, that might reduce Medicaid outlays over the long run. One of the advantages of the portfolio approach, whether it's done in an incremental way like we've suggested, or the more ambitious way that Bill and I support of committee reorganization, where we, for example, have a health committee, is that we'd be focusing on the policy issues as well as on budgetary costs and scoring. Right now, the process just excessively focuses on annual scoring and not enough on the big picture.
2 things. One, if what is going on in our political world right now is not a crisis, I don't know what is. I think we have a crisis of government, of governing, though it may not be an economic crisis, that should be sufficient to propel the newly elected leaders to say, how can we get governing back on track? And I think that is trying some confidence-building measures. But as to health, the reason I didn't put health first is I think it's too difficult. I'd put Social Security first and the entitlement reform, because I don't think it's that hard. And I think you could find some common ground there. And the thing about health is, A, it's really difficult if you're going to make major changes, but B, you don't need to. A lot of the reforms that would make our system of delivering health care more cost-effective are actually happening. And we've had very small increases in health care costs, despite the rigmarole about premium increases in the ACA. They're very small. We've had very small increases in total health spending recently. So we're not in a crisis there, and we're on the track to some solutions.
Can I just quickly respond that two things. I agree with Alice that healthcare costs have come down on a per capita basis. The difficulty is the capitas are going up at the same time, and that's creating a spending issue. But to your question, I think also, and I agree with Alice, on Social Security, we have a crisis coming. And it is 2033, 2034 in terms of a 22% reduction from what people think. So I think the time to address Social Security is now. We've always talked about it.
And those people aren't our grandchildren. They're middle-aged workers.
There's people in this room here.
That's right.
And the other point I would simply make, this goes back to one of the earlier discussions about the presentation. I think we've got a problem with our, quote, baselines, because it's always a cut. We're not talking about cuts. We're talking about slowing the rate of growth, and that's different. And somehow that part of it. I remember, also finally, when Secretary Panetta was leaving his job, he said there are two ways to address these budget issues. One is through crisis, and the second is through leadership. And I think the it's back to the big picture here. Unless we have some bipartisan leadership, not only out of Congress, but out of the executive branch too, we're not going to solve this problem. And when you have bipartisanship, then we all walk the gangplank together, and we all take responsibility. It's not just Republican or Democrat.
I just have one thing to add, which I think that you're absolutely right to hit on the importance of thinking about the political incentives of the individual members who you would need to get on board to build a coalition here. I think the question is, even in something that we might consider a crisis, are those political incentives there for all of the members that we would need them to be? And I just don't know if that's true.
You know, I wondered how long it would take us to get to baselines as an issue. we got through 93 minutes. I think that's a pretty good record, actually. But anyway, there's a question over here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the second time I'm asking a question, but I've asked this question numerous times before, and I've never really gotten a satisfactory answer. Does the Washington establishment really understand not how only angry and frustrated the people are, but many have been mortally wounded financially, and it's going to take them generations, if at all, to recoup what they've lost in the last Great Recession? Is there any wonder why we have Donald Trump? I hate to say it, I don't know who's in favor of him here, but, you know, and to some degree, Bernie Sanders. I just want a thermometer or a barometer as, does the Washington establishment understand this, or are we always going to talk about policy and all these 30,000 feet issues? Thank you.
Anyone want to try that one?
There's a lot of anger out there, and the Washington establishment, I think the national establishment, bears a lot of the blame, in my opinion, first and foremost for allowing the financial crisis of 2008 to happen. That was unnecessary. The record since then has been of recovery, but not repairing the basic damage. That said, the question of how government responds once you have a set of elected leaders, and I think it's going to be divided government, and it's going to be coming into a very polarized and angry situation, but it's got to focus on policy, and that's what we're talking about.
I just will say that, number one, there is a lot of anger. I know, and firsthand coming from the Midwest. And if some of you haven't read this little book called The Hillbilly Elegy, read it, because I think it communicates pretty quickly that there is some real anger out there. But at the same, and I told somebody this earlier this morning, I mean, when you come to Washington from the Midwest, you say, this is not home. I'm always going back to the farm. And I've been here for more than 40 years now, so I guess can call this home. But my problem is that I came here with the idea that policy mattered and would help make things better for people. And so while we obviously have screwed up policy, I wonder, at least for a large chunk of people out there today, I wonder what if my time here has been in vain for 40 years. What have we brought except conferences and talk about these things? So there is a real, I get your message, if nothing else. And I don't know, but I still have faith in the system that it can correct itself, and policy matters for those people out there.
Well, I wonder, Bill, just bearing in mind what the question said, that this is something which is not unique to one side of the political spectrum. You mentioned both Trump and Bernie Sanders. It's a bipartisan kind of feeling, a deep feeling of an anger around the country that Washington isn't functioning. And do you think that I mean, you mentioned the idea of a joint committee and so on. Is the time right, and are you seeing the kind of agreement across the aisle that we, in the sense of we in the Washington community, that at least have, not myself, but at least have control of the government in some way, have a mutual interest, no matter what their view of what policy should be enacted or even the size of government, they have a mutual interest in beginning to take some steps, albeit maybe incrementally and visibly, probably with an idea that you've raised often, which is that we ought to have a pay requirement, that a pay reduction on members of Congress if they don't reach agreements and they don't keep the timelines, which I think would be very popular around the country and is. Is the time right for this kind of bipartisan approach?
But by the way, that's Bill Hoagland. I'm not being paid by Congress, so whenever I made that proposal, it usually gets shot down anyway, particularly by members of Congress. Right. So I don't think there's any chance there. But no, I think this election is heightened the issue in the American public, and I think the message will come through. Whether that will lead to something that will start to address these concerns, who knows? But I do think we're at a tipping point here, and I think elected officials are taking notice. Let's put it that way.
Other questions?
Can I say one thing?
Sorry.
Two things. First, Bill, I think you should look in the mirror and say I've done good over your career, number one. There are a number of reasons why people are angry. I think some of them are justified based on their economic status, and others are really representation of the worst parts of our history, and are being reflected by some of the stances taken by the Republican presidential candidate. But to get to the political science research, there's a fair amount of evidence that a lot of Americans dislike government because they dislike observing conflict. And some of that, they don't like watching debates. They don't like seeing disagreements and clashing values. And to some extent, that's unfortunate. But the negative reaction is magnified when the Washington establishment, as you put it, doesn't see a need to try and move away from responding to the immediate political incentives they face to try and build confidence, as Stuart made the analogy. What we need in the budget process is a joint effort across the party divide to try and reestablish some basic norms, as Alice said, of compromise. of paying attention to the information that Phil says is out there, which is relatively high quality, particularly on the cost side of the budget, maybe a little less on the benefit side. So I think there's actually a lot of relevance of this topic to the general problem that you described. We need to think about a way in which we can use the budget process and other processes that Congress uses to set out policy differences and then try and resolve them in a much more intelligent and patriotic way.
I just have one thing to build on Roy's point, which is that first to sort of say that I think there's some pretty good evidence that this election is about more than just voter anger. It's the story is much more complicated than that. But also to say that it's when members of Congress come to Washington and sort of fight out the fights that they have about policy, to the extent that they do that, they're not operating in a vacuum. They're responding to the incentives that the voters who sent them to Washington sent them here to do. And so if they're behaving the way that they are, we have to ask why are they doing that, and what are the incentives that they're responding to.
Can I just add one last comment on my part, because this bothers me a lot, and that is that the establishment, and I would imagine most of the people in this room are the establishment inside the Beltway, all that, is not saying, we're not saying that our democratic election process is rigged. Somebody outside the establishment is saying that, and that's undercutting our ability to govern.
Other questions? Yes, Dan Crippen.
A couple of observations. Just
could you just mention your name?
Oh, I'm sorry. Dan Crippen, as I've described to many of you, government has been. One of my former roles was executive director of the CBO. A couple of quick observations for whatever they're worth. One, first, I agree with much of what has been said and recommended for changes in the budget process. It's not working now, and we ought to try something to make it work better. But for much of its history, the budget process has proven to be more a speed bump than a roadblock. It reminds people of what they are doing and tries to inform them of that, but certainly doesn't prevent some of the things that we've seen in the past of major entitlement additions, major tax cuts, those kinds of things, even though there were violations of both the budget process and rules. First observation, if you will, is that, as Bill knows better than I, the core of the Budget Act is really a suspension, change, or waiver of Senate rules. We've talked a lot today about House, but it's really the Senate rules that form or the changes that form the core of the Budget Act, because it restricts filibuster, it requires germaneness. Now with the Byrd rule, there are lots of other restrictions. So, in effect, it's the Senate that you're talking about changing much of the House has the convenience, of course, of a rules committee, in which they can waive many of the rules that are required by the Budget Act or other things. Second observation is that while congressional reform is a great thing for lots of reasons, we've tried it, as Bill said, I think, several times in the past. It made a little progress. The Senate had a committee early on, Senate-only committee early on in the 80s, and it made some changes about how things are done, how defense budgets are considered, those kinds of things. But in the main, the House and the Senate both have single committees that are responsible for much of the entitlement programs we've been talking about. The Senate Finance Committee has complete jurisdiction over taxes, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So the various things we've talked about needing in terms of a policy context are in a single committee. I don't know how reorganization would change that, but it doesn't take reorganization in sense to get the committee process at least to work. And of course, as many of you know, the House Ways and Means Committee has Social Security, taxes, and Medicare. So there too, many of the things we've talked about are single committees. So I think what I'm suggesting is the budget process reforms are very good. We need to do them. Better information, if we could, better people. But they won't be ultimately productive or producing better outcomes, and that we could do some things now by looking at single committees and how to perhaps get them to do activity.
Any reaction? Everybody agree? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
The only thing I would say is that your characterization of the Budget Act as being a lot about sort of reallocating power in the Senate, I think is completely consistent with sort of where I started my comments, which is saying that when we think about any of these changes, the question that we need to ask is who has power now and who would get or lose power in under the changes.
I have a question at the back.
Hi, Paul Posner. Sorry. George Mason University, and collaborator and co-conspirator with some of these people. And I totally endorse my budget hat, the reform impulse. But I also think Molly has a point that somehow we have to have a more finer-grained sense of the political feasibility. So in a sense, when you look at the politics of budgeting in this country in the past 50 years, it's been an ad hoc coalition. It's required some forms of bipartisan or cross-partisan collaboration, not with all the parties. And we see that in other countries, Netherlands and the like, that coalitions form. And in Europe, they're very strongly bound to a parliamentary system by incentives. If the coalition fails, the government goes out of business as a vote of no confidence, and you have to start over. That's a huge penalty. In our system, that doesn't seem to be a penalty. The failure to abide by an ad hoc coalition on the budget seems to have no cost. In fact, it has benefits, potentially, because factions can exploit that and campaign against the coalition and against the reigning economic ideas of the day and possibly strengthen themselves in the polls. And I think somehow we have to understand when we think about this election, not just the implications for the Congress, but the implications for our party system. What kind of Republican Party in particular is going to emerge? Is the politics of coalition building still going to be perceived as politically advantageous to enough House and Senate members to recognize, to enable them to live with some of the compromise? Or is there still going to be a premium, as we've seen the past 6 years, of holding out and not valuing government action, but rather valuing the gains you get from being a holdout and living to have a better political result, ultimately to changing the mathematics of that coalition? So I do think we have to recognize, sadly to some of us, that we're really kind of a victim of not dead economists, but political forces that we don't really understand that well. And I think what's going to happen inside the Republican Party after November 8th is going to be critical to whether any of these governance reforms are going to happen.
Any thoughts on that?
I'll just say this, Paul, which is that historically, when we've seen sort of intra-party divisions emerge, particularly in the House, one response to that has been to decentralize power away from the Speaker. And so one thing to sort of look forward to is to see if that is a response, or if the kind of system that we're in now makes that response no longer an effective way to manage divisions within the House majority party. Because at the end of the day, our congressional institutions have evolved and are designed for a two-party system and not for a party system that doesn't deal well with division within its ranks.
Any other questions? Yes. Dan, we'll make this last one.
I don't mean to throw a rock in the punch bowl.
Oh, well,
but
don't.
what about we've talked a little bit about the appropriations process, and portfolio budgeting would have a tremendous impact upon the Appropriations Committee and its jurisdiction. Where do the appropriators fit into this mix of budget process reforms? In the past, there's been, at best, a reluctance on their part to embrace biennial budgeting. And for the last few years, they've been the budget process. So what are your thoughts on that?
Bill, do you want to start on that?
I agree with you. I've had clashes with my appropriation colleagues over the years, and whenever I talk about biennial budgeting, clashes get even worse. And quite frankly, they'll tell me that, Bill, we're the only ones that are actually governing. We're doing the oversight, we're doing the appropriations, and to some extent, that's absolutely correct. But that's not the way the process is supposed to work. That's why we have authorizing committees. So it'll never happen. Come on, guys, it'll never happen. We're not going to collapse the authorizings and the appropriation committees together. That's not going to happen. But we can strengthen the authorization process to give more oversight on the appropriation process. I don't know what the latest figures were, $350 billion worth of expenditures, or appropriated that are not authorized. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. So I do think that your idea, Steve and Paul's idea about some portfolio budgeting could strengthen strengthen the authorizing budgeting process and impact the appropriation process. I have no qualms with moving forward with some form of changing that structure. Last comment I'll make is that I also do think, said on here early, I do think you need to strengthen the budget committee structure too, and that if that brings putting back the chairman and by the way, when the Budget Act was set up, some of those original members were chairman of finance, chairman of appropriation, chairman of the defense committee, and that we've lost that, and you need to get back to that structure, I think, to give the budget committees more of a leadership type role.
Okay, I want to question or challenge your assertion that the appropriations are the budget process the last couple of years. Yes, there's an agreement in 2015 adjusting the caps. Look at the status of appropriations bills page. Where are the 302Bs in one house? Why is it so difficult to get the motion to proceed to move an appropriations bill in the other house? I mean, basically, the appropriations process is fundamentally broken. And in addition, it doesn't cover the massive amount of spending on the mandatory side or tax preferences. The appropriators do play important roles now, and any revised process will need to have careful, smart, both on substance and politics, clerks who oversee the agencies. But that can be done through a combined authorizations and appropriations process as well. The way we have it set up now is rather absurd in a number of respects. Just look at the highway bill, surface transportation. We can't get an agreement on raising taxes because of the pledge. We have BA in one category, outlays in another. It's nonsensical. Anyone who pays attention to some of we can do the same thing with Pell Grants. Some people here from CBO who spend endless years dealing with arcane scoring issues to follow the rules that make little sense. So if we're really going to pay attention to the fine details of the budget process, you learn more and more the need for more comprehensive reform, acknowledging that, yes, it's difficult to do, but let's at least try and make some baby steps in the direction of pretending that the appropriations process is the only thing that matters.
Well, we seem to have resolved this issue slightly ahead of schedule and below budget. So I think it's a real example to the country that Washington can function in dealing with these issues. So I want to thank the panel very much. And